In a small, forgotten village resting on the edge of a dusty plain, there lived a poor widow named Mama Abeni. Her days were long and heavy with hardship, for since the passing of her husband, she had lived alone in a mud-walled hut with no children to comfort her and no farmland rich enough to feed her. Each morning, she rose before the sun, her frail back bending as she carried bundles of firewood from the forest, which she sold in the market for a few coins. With what little she earned, she bought maize, ground it into flour, and made thin bread to survive. Her neighbors often pitied her and sometimes ridiculed her, for though she had little to eat, she was known for sharing even the smallest portion with those who came to her door. They called her foolish for giving away food when her own stomach was empty, but Mama Abeni always answered, "A closed hand can never receive blessings, but an open one never goes without." One evening, as the sun lowered into the horizon and painted the sky with streaks of fire, she sat alone on her mat with a single piece of flatbread before her. It was all she had saved for supper, and her stomach had been growling since the morning, yet before she could eat, a faint sound reached her ears, the shuffle of weak footsteps, followed by a voice so small it was almost swallowed by the wind. She opened her door to see a boy no older than 10, thin as a reed, his face streaked with dust, his lips cracked with thirst, and his ribs showing through the tatters of his shirt. He looked at her with hollow eyes, and in a trembling whisper, he begged, "Please, just a little food, before I die." Mama Abeni froze, her heart torn between her hunger and the child's desperation. The bread on her mat was her only meal for the day, and tomorrow's firewood would not fetch enough money until noon. Yet as she looked into the boy's eyes, she felt a stirring deep within her spirit, something stronger than fear of hunger, something she knew was the voice of compassion. Slowly, with trembling hands, she broke the bread in two and placed the larger piece into the boy's hands. "Eat, my son," she said softly, "for life must not end tonight. Tomorrow will take care of itself." The boy devoured the bread with tears of gratitude running down his face, then, too weak to move further, curled up on a mat beside her hearth and fell into a deep sleep. That night, Mama Abeni lay awake, her stomach empty but her heart strangely full, whispering prayers over the boy's slumber. In her soul, she felt she had not lost anything but instead gained something beyond measure. The next morning, when her neighbors saw the strange child in her hut, they laughed and mocked her. "Foolish woman," they said, "to waste your last bread on a beggar who will run away the moment he is strong enough. You will starve for nothing." But Mama Abeni only smiled quietly and answered, "The river never forgets the stone that cooled it." Seasons passed like the slow turning of the river, and soon the boy whom Mama Abeni had once fed grew strong enough to work and travel. He stayed with her for a few weeks, helping her gather firewood, carrying water jars, and sweeping the compound, but one dawn, when the air was still cool and the birds had only just begun their morning chorus, he disappeared without a word, leaving behind only the impression of his small body on the sleeping mat. When Mama Abeni woke and saw the empty space, her heart ached, but she did not curse him or regret her kindness. Instead, she whispered a prayer to the winds, asking that wherever his feet carried him, he would remember the bread that had saved him. The villagers mocked her even more, laughing at her foolishness for wasting her last meal on a nameless orphan. "He is gone," they jeered, "and you are left hungry as always. What profit is there in kindness?" Yet Mama Abeni only bowed her head and replied, "The seed that is planted may be forgotten in the soil, but it grows where eyes cannot see." Meanwhile, far beyond the village, the orphan boy wandered across lands unknown, surviving first by carrying loads for travelers, then by tending animals, until he found himself in the company of traders who moved across kingdoms with salt, spices, and cloth. They saw his quick mind and his hunger to learn, and though he began as a servant, he soon became their apprentice. He studied the languages of markets, the weight of gold against ivory, and the skill of bargaining with chiefs and kings. Every step he took carried him farther from the poor village, yet in his heart, he often remembered the warmth of a widow's hut, the taste of shared bread, and the words she had spoken about open hands never going empty. As years rolled into decades, the boy grew into a man of remarkable vision and perseverance. He built caravans that stretched for miles, wagons heavy with treasures, and men loyal to his name. He became known as Kwame the Prosperous, a merchant whose wealth rivaled rulers, whose generosity won him allies across deserts and rivers. His story spread across towns and kingdoms, told by griots who marveled at how a boy once near death had risen to power. Yet for all his riches, Kwame's heart never forgot the night he had been saved by a poor widow who gave him half her bread. Though the world now bowed to him, he often lay awake under tents of silk, remembering her words and her sacrifice, vowing that one day, he would return to the land where hunger had almost claimed him, and where kindness had instead given him life. Back in the village, Mama Abeni had grown old, her hair silver and her steps slower, but she never ceased her habits of giving. To every beggar who came to her door, she gave a little water, a scrap of bread, or even just a blessing whispered with sincerity. And though the villagers still called her foolish, she carried within her a quiet certainty that kindness, once sown, always bore fruit, even if its harvest was unseen. The years had rolled by like dust carried on the wind, and Mama Abeni, once a strong woman with quick steps, had grown frail, her back bent and her hands gnarled from years of gathering firewood. Her hut still stood at the edge of the village, weathered by sun and storm, yet she lived quietly, surviving on the little she could earn, always sharing what she had with those poorer than herself. Many of her age mates had passed away, and the younger villagers often looked at her with a mix of pity and scorn, still whispering that her kindness had been wasted, for the orphan she once fed had long since vanished, swallowed by the world. One morning, however, as the village prepared for its market day and women spread their mats with baskets of yams, groundnuts, and dried fish, a distant rumble was heard, like the earth itself trembling. At first, the people thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear, the sun blazing bright, and soon dust clouds rose on the horizon, growing larger until the villagers saw what caused it. A procession was coming, unlike anything they had ever witnessed. White horses adorned with red and gold cloth, drummers beating rhythms that made the ground shake, servants carrying baskets covered in silk, and at the center, a golden carriage that glittered in the sun like a piece of heaven rolling upon the earth. The villagers abandoned their stalls and ran to the roadside, their mouths wide with awe, whispering to one another, "Which king comes to our forgotten land? What ruler finds interest in our poor village?" The drums grew louder as the golden carriage halted in the village square, and from it descended a tall man dressed in fine garments of deep blue and embroidered gold, his presence commanding respect, his skin glowing with health, his eyes sharp yet softened with warmth. The villagers bowed low, eager to welcome him, but the man's gaze moved past them, searching, until it landed upon a small figure bent under a bundle of firewood. Slowly, he stepped forward, the crowd parting like waves before him, and when he reached the frail woman, he dropped to his knees in the dust before her, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Mama Abeni." The crowd gasped, shocked that this mighty figure, who surely must be a king, would kneel before an old, poor widow. Mama Abeni raised her head, blinking against the glare, confused at first, until her weary eyes met his. And then, in a rush, memory flooded her heart, the hollow eyes of a starving boy, the trembling hands reaching for bread, the whispered plea for life. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes, as the man's voice cracked again, "I am the boy you fed when I had nothing, the boy who would have died without you. Today I return, not as a beggar, but as Kwame the Prosperous." The villagers gasped louder still, stunned that the ragged orphan they had mocked had become the man of legend, and shame filled their hearts as they remembered how they had scorned the widow's kindness. The square fell silent as Kwame, the man now revered across kingdoms, knelt before the frail widow who had once saved his life with half a piece of bread. Tears streamed down Mama Abeni's wrinkled face as her trembling hands touched his shoulders, her heart overwhelmed by the sight of the boy she thought she had lost forever, now returned in glory. The villagers stood frozen, ashamed of their mockery, unable to believe that the woman they had ridiculed for her foolish kindness was now being honored by the most powerful man they had ever seen. Rising to his feet, Kwame turned to the crowd and declared in a voice that echoed like thunder, "Without this woman, I would not be alive. When the world turned its back on me, when hunger gnawed at my bones, she gave me her last piece of bread. She gave me life. And today I have come not only to honor her but to make her the mother of my house, for whoever honors me must honor her first." At his command, servants rushed forward carrying baskets filled with gold coins, fine cloth, fragrant oils, and food enough to feed an army. They laid the treasures at Mama Abeni's feet until the ground before her was covered in wealth that no villager had ever imagined. Then, with a wave of his hand, Kwame ordered that her hut be torn down and replaced with a grand house of stone and carved wood, a home fit not for a poor widow but for a queen. The villagers who once mocked her now fell to their knees, begging her forgiveness, but Mama Abeni only smiled gently and said, "Do not bow to me, bow to kindness, for it is the only wealth that never fades." From that day on, her life of struggle ended, for Kwame visited often, treating her as his true mother, sitting at her side, listening to her wisdom, and ensuring her days were filled with honor and peace. The story of the widow and the orphan spread across lands far beyond their village, carried by griots and travelers, told beside fires and in market squares as a lesson for generations, that one small act of compassion can echo through time, turning rags into riches, despair into hope, and strangers into family. And so, Mama Abeni lived the rest of her days in comfort, surrounded not by hunger but by gratitude, while Kwame continued to rule his trade and wealth with the same generosity she had shown him. And when she passed on, old and full of years, the people of many lands came to honor her burial, for she was no longer remembered as the poor widow of a forgotten village, but as the mother whose single act of kindness had birthed a legacy greater than gold.